areas that we are proposing in the new framework are quality of education, behaviour and attitudes, personal development and leadership and management. So you can see leadership and management is still one of the 4 judgment areas. You will see in this graph they are of different size. That's not a coincidence because the quality of education judgment really is the central one in the new education inspection framework. So does that mean leadership and management have become less important? Well, as I will come to later, that's not necessarily the conclusion you need to draw from that, because leadership and management is not divorced from quality of education, of course. So what we have done to try and make that link between the evidence base and the framework is go through a program of research in our research and evaluation team to inform that development. That has had a number of different elements. So we did a review of the literature on educational effectiveness across those 4 areas, so quality of education, leadership and management, personal development and behaviour and attitudes, to see what evidence was out there and therefore what could we build some of our judgments and criteria on. That research commentary is published. You can have a look at that on the gov.uk website. We also did some original research ourselves, because one of the things that we found was that there is more evidence in some areas than in others. We feel that curriculum is really central to what we need to look at, because that lies at the heart of what we are actually teaching pupils and what they actually learn. But what we found was that there was less recent research on curriculum in England that could inform our judgments. So we did quite a large-scale program of research on curriculum to help us to do that, starting in 2017 with a piece of work where we went into, I think, 40 schools to look at what they were currently doing around curriculum. And when we did that, we found a number of the issues I talked about earlier. So we found things like teaching to the test, narrowing of the curriculum. We also found that there was not necessarily a lot of curriculum thinking in schools, and that's not so surprising because, of course, the system has come through a long period in which curriculum was either prescribed through, say, national curriculum documents and national strategies, and even when more and more schools got curriculum freedom, the non-maintained ones, it was the case that because of the emphasis on attainment in the accountability system, in many cases the exam syllabus became the curriculum instead. Decided to look specifically at schools that were very invested in curriculum development, so a purposive sample of schools who were doing particularly interesting work in that, and those findings were then used to develop a draft model of inspecting the curriculum, which we tested in a more representative group of 64 schools in autumn this year. We've also done a number of other pieces of work. So currently we're looking at validity and reliability of lesson observation and work scrutiny, two methods that are obviously quite central to inspection, and we will be publishing those findings in the middle of March. We also have some research projects ongoing on managing challenging behaviour, so looking at what schools do to manage behaviour effectively, and we have a project ongoing on teacher well-being, both those projects also to be published soon. So one of the commitments that we have made is to make sure that everything we do is published and available in our research program, so that it's also open to scrutiny from yourselves and from other researchers. So all those things kind of feed into the development of the education inspection framework, along obviously with things like the expertise of the inspectors who are working with us. So also in the area of leadership and management, we try and draw on as much evidence as possible. So we did a review of the evidence on educational leadership from very much an effectiveness paradigm, so looking at where we have evidence that leadership can lead to school improvement and school effectiveness. We drew on a range of sources for that, trying to look quite a lot at some of the research that has obviously been conducted in England and the UK because it's most directly relevant, looking at cross phases, primary and secondary, and trying to see what that is telling us, and therefore how can that inform what we need to look at in inspection, because we want to make sure that we look at the right things. What does that evidence tell us? First, it does tell us that leadership is pretty important. There is a lot of research out there that suggests that leadership is the main school-level factor affecting outcomes, and I say school level because there are things that have a stronger impact, in particular what happens in the classroom. So when you look at the factors that affect pupil progress, then what happens in the classroom has the strongest effect, but leadership from the school level factors is the most important one. The second strongest impact we usually find from leadership. And of course those two things are not divorced from each other, because we know that one of the ways that you are effective as a leader is by creating the conditions under which classroom teachers can be as effective as they possibly can be. If you look at it statistically, you see that leadership explains around 5 to 7% of the variance in pupil attainment. And you can say, oh, that's not very much, but that's actually around a quarter of the variance explained by the fact that pupils go to different schools. So when you look at pupil attainment, of course, there are a number of things that influence that. Firstly, there is what pupil himself brings to the situation, their motivation, their prior knowledge, and so on. That obviously is a very key factor. Then there is what happens in the classroom, and we find, as I say, that that is a key factor that influences. And also we mustn't forget that whenever we look at any measure of attainment, a part of the variance is what we call measurement error, which is a combination of just coincidences. For example, a certain pupil has had a fall from his bike on the way to school and therefore has done this well in assessment. To things like the fact that any assessment is only measuring part of the domain that you are actually assessing. You've only got certain items. They do that with more or less reliability, but it's never 100% reliability. A question can always be misinterpreted and so on. So actually we find that leadership is pretty significant, and they mainly work through other factors. So what do leaders do? They do things like making sure that there is a shared vision in the school, that there are shared approaches, and that in turn affects what happens in the classroom, which in turn affects what pupils do. So when we looked at the literature, we kind of came up with 5 main factors that across a number of different studies appear to be important. Things like vision, instructional leadership, consistency, encouraging professional development, and ethical leadership. And those are kind of, when you look at the inspection framework, you will see those things coming back in the criteria that we're looking at in the leadership and management judgment. So what do we find about those things in particular? Please click. Okay, so in terms of vision, obviously this is no surprise. We see that in education, but we also see that in organizational literature across different sectors, public and private. Clear shared vision underpins effectiveness of a school or other organizations, but it has to have some concrete effects. So an effective vision actually influences what leaders do, what teachers do, what teaching assistants do, so provides a clear sense of direction for the whole of the organization. It should be a touchstone against which all initiatives are actually tested, so you need to think, if you're doing something, okay, does that fit in with what we want to be as a school, with who we are as a school? And as you can imagine, that of course links also with the issue of ethical leadership. Buy-in, of course, is very important then, because it is something that everybody needs to share, and that means that in many cases we see that vision is most successfully developed in collaboration rather than just as a top-down thing that you sort of impose on the school as a leader. Instructional leadership is again one of the most strongly supported factors in educational research, and what that is, it seems very straightforward. It's about leadership focusing on the quality of education. And again, that is very similar to what we find in sectors outside of education, where it's about focusing on the core purposes of the organization. And what is the core purpose of a school? Surely that is the quality of education. If we define it, you can see a definition by Hallinger and Heck, two researchers from North America, who says it's those actions that a principal or head teacher takes or delegates to others to promote growth in pupil learning, make instructional quality the top priority of the school, and bring that vision to realization. So it's really about focusing on that quality of education dimension. Of course, in this definition, which is quite old now, there is a strong emphasis on the principal or head teacher, but we know from more recent research that that can obviously be also a much more distributed process which involves leadership across the school. So you can say, that's really an obvious thing to say, school leaders concentrate on quality of education, but what we actually see in practice when we do research around what leaders actually do, what they spend their time on, is that in many cases a very large proportion, and often the largest proportion of time, is not spent on those kind of activities, but is spent on administration, crisis management, and things like that. So I have to give you an example. I remember once visiting primary school, and I needed to speak to the head, and couldn't immediately find him because he was up on the roof repairing the roof. Okay, that no doubt needs doing, but is that the best way of a head teacher to spend his time? Probably not. So it's about having hands-on involvement in teaching and learning, and having therefore some views and knowledge and a vision around curriculum, around pedagogy, around assessment. Again, that has some consequences, because especially if you are in a larger organization, if you are part of, say, a large college, for example, that leads to the question as to where does that expertise lie? And again, we need to say that that's not necessarily always the person of the principal, her or himself. That can lie at other layers of the organization instead. Similarly, that may be the case in some multi-academy trusts. But it does mean in an organization you need that level of expertise to be available. Another key factor we see around effectiveness and around leadership of effective schools is the issue of consistency. So what we actually see is when we compare schools on effectiveness, it's not so much that there's that it is the case that in less effective schools there is no good practice. That's not the case at all. Any school you go into, you can find some excellent teachers, some good work in specific areas, and so on. What we find instead is that in effective schools there is a level of consistent quality across different subjects, across different areas, etc., whereas in ineffective schools that tends to be very varied. So what, in fact, leaders are able to do in those more effective schools is reduce the variance by making sure that you don't have kind of a tail of poor practice happening within a school. So that's a key aspect to take into account. And that means that you kind of need to think about how do we align practices at different levels in the school. So, for example, in secondary school, are school-level policies mirrored in what happens in the department? Is that vision shared? Are we doing similar things? It's about learning from best practice within our school, because as I've said, there is always good practice that we can learn from. So where is that good practice? How can we learn from it? How can we spread that? Do we use specific methods for that, like lesson study, or do we use observation, or how do we make sure that we build on the personal capital that we have in our own organization to spread that around and to make sure that we learn from each other? It doesn't, of course, mean that we all have to do everything the same. There is a need for flexibility because we are working, for example, with different subjects which have their own disciplinary core, which means that you you can't say, oh, let's all teach exactly the same, because what effective teaching looks like in history is not the same as what effective teaching looks like in mathematics, for example. Similarly, we have different pupils that we work for, so again, if we have a particular group that we're teaching, we need to make sure that we can adapt where necessary to that. So it's not about being inflexible, it's about making sure that we remove the poor practice where it is, and that we learn from the best of what happens in our schools. Of course, also very important then is encouraging professional development, and that's one of the things that we have found also in some of our other research. There is quite a bit of evidence that professional development is linked to effectiveness in schools, but it's something that is sometimes overlooked a bit in the day-to-day work of management, because it's not something that you can necessarily point to and say, okay, if we do professional development, that's going to have really quick impacts on the attainment of pupils. It takes more time for professional development to show its effects in schools, but if we want to have long-term sustainable improvement and effectiveness, it is really a key thing that we need to do. There is quite a lot of research now on what good CPD looks like, and a number of years ago a piece of work was produced by the Teacher Development Trust, led by Philippa Cordingley. A very interesting piece of work on CPD. I very much recommend looking at that. Some of the things that they summarized, because they did a big review of the evidence, some of the things they found in that review was you need to make sure that you spend some time on CPD, because often longer-term programs are more effective than sort of one-off, one-shot things. So typical doing just, say, an inset about, I don't know, updating your subject knowledge, doing that once and then not following up, that tends not to have very much effect necessarily. So you do need to build follow-up in making sure that there's opportunity to practice as well. We often forget that. It's interesting that some of the things that we know and always do when we teach young people, we sometimes forget about when we look at our own professional development. So just in the same way that you wouldn't just teach a child or young person something and then expect them to remember that without any practice or opportunity for follow-up, that's also true when we look at adult education as well. Of course, it needs to be relevant to the needs that we actually have. Professional development is not just something we do for fun of it. It does have to have relevance to what we do, and where we need to think, what we need to think about more there is the fact that just in the same way that, again, young people don't come to our classrooms with the same prior knowledge or background, that is also true of us as adults as well. So we need to make sure that what we do is actually tailored to what we really need. So if I was asked to teach, say, a geography class tomorrow, then a key area that I would need to work on would be my subject knowledge. So I would need some professional development in that. That would not be true of the geography teacher sitting next to me. So make sure that we actually do what is useful for the individual. And interestingly, we see that it's important that we develop an understanding of why we are doing certain things. So some understanding of the theory or the rationale behind what we are learning. There's been a bit of a tendency in recent decades to kind of discount the role and importance of theory in education, but actually there's a lot of evidence that we do things better if we know why they actually matter as well. So, final element in terms of the review of the literature that we did was around ethical practices. And again, that stands to reason that that is important, but we do see a number of things in the system that worry us. Firstly, as part of the gaming that I mentioned earlier, there is evidence in some schools of off-rolling, so where we are illegally removing pupils from the school world for the purposes of gaming the accountability system. That's not the same as legal exclusion. Schools have a right to exclude pupils if they have to follow proper procedures for that. But obviously, just removing somebody because that is going to harm your GCSE scores or something like that is a whole different matter. So we have been doing some analysis within Ofsted to see, to look at schools which have especially high numbers of pupils going off-roll between years 10 and 11, and where that appears to be a problem, we will then follow that up and try to get to the heart of what is happening here. Of course, we cannot say that something wrong is going on or not. We need to go to the school and find out what the reasons are for that. Another area that is growing in importance is the area of staff well-being. We, as said, we did a big piece of research on well-being, and which we will publish shortly. We did 2 rounds of questionnaires for that, and what we found in the first round, which we did in the summer term, was that 59% of teachers, 35% of senior leaders, and 47% of classroom assistants reported low to medium levels of occupational well-being. That's pretty alarming. That is worrying for us as a system, worrying in terms also of the issue of retention and recruitment of staff, which we know is a big issue. We find that more than half of staff think that their workload is dry, that they don't have a good work-life balance. So again, clearly a big problem with that. We recognize that part of that may have been driven by the way the accountability system has developed in the last few years. And certainly one of the things that we want to look at in the framework is how can we mitigate that, and also how can we take into account whether or not school leaders are cognizant and give some importance to the well-being of their staff. We don't want the kind of management practices that are particularly deleterious to staff that we hear about in some cases. And of course, in terms of ethical leadership, also in terms of effectiveness, it's important that as schools we do not see ourselves as some kind of self-contained organisation, that we engage with our parents and also with our community. We have a responsibility to the community as a whole, not only to the kids who are at that particular moment in our school. So those are some things that we found from our research on leadership, and those are some of the things that we use to inform the judgment area of leadership and management. So when you look at our framework and handbooks, you will find those kind of things back in terms of how we are going to make judgments on leadership and management. But of course, as I said earlier, leadership isn't just important to the areas of the leadership and management judgment, it actually permeates the whole of the framework. I'm going to give you 2 specific examples of that. One is from curriculum, which is part of the quality of education judgment, and the other is on behaviour and attitudes, just to give you an illustration of really the importance of leadership in all the judgment areas. So, curriculum, I'm going to give you some of the findings from the curriculum research I talked about earlier. So, we looked at curriculum intent, implementation and impact, and we found very clearly that the role of leadership is very central in those schools that we selected that were particularly invested in curriculum development. We found, for example, that the role of subject leaders is really key. That's not surprising because, of course, when you look at curriculum, there is a strong subject element to that. And we found that where subject leaders were strongly involved in developing the curriculum of the school or in choosing the curriculum for the school, because it's important here to point out that we do not expect every school to develop its own bespoke curriculum. It can be entirely appropriate to buy in or to collectively develop a curriculum if that works for your particular school. But In any case, subject leaders need to have a view on what works for their subject, why a particular curriculum would work for them. Where we see that that's not the case, and we did find some schools in which they had a strong curriculum, but it was all coming from the head teacher. Those were obviously primarily primary schools. That can work for a while, but what happens when that person leaves the school? We know successful head teachers do actually quite often leave their school. They go and work at the Department of Education, for example. So what do we do then if that knowledge of those skills are not disseminated across the organisation? So subject lead is very important, but but the autonomy of the subject lead, of course, has to be within a framework of a shared vision of the school, so you can have that consistency and also the thinking about how we do curriculum across the different subjects and what are the commonalities that we need to develop in the school. So phase 2 showed that, but not just